The Viking Age is a truly fascinating part in our history because we really don't know that much about it. It is a dark age, not in the sense that the people in that time were under-advanced or unintelligent, but it's an era in our history timeline that is left quite in the dark. Much of that sort of era we really don't know much about. And that can pose an issue in trying to understand the people in that culture. And of course, the Scandinavians in that time, the Norse or the Vikings, were a very famous part of that era. The Viking Age, of course, got its name because there were a lot of Viking exhibitions going around the world at that time. Through this sort of mysterious part in our history, of course, the Viking raider gets a massive spotlight in film and video games and popular culture. However, we don't really know what these raiders would have looked like. Now, of course, just as a side note here, I'll be using the term Viking just because it is sort of the most understood term. However, a Viking was just someone that went on a Viking. So not all Scandinavians in that time period were called Vikings. They would have likely been called the Norse, the Danes, other sort of names like that. A Viking is just someone who goes on a raid, someone who goes on a Viking, someone who goes on an exhibition. And these Vikings weren't all raiders. Many of them were traders and explorers, really. So there were some Scandinavian people who definitely raided in the Viking Age. However, many of them were just settlers and traders as well. With this era being quite mysterious, it's of course quite hard for us to tell what these raiders would have necessarily looked like, with our sort of idea of what that is in popular culture possibly taking us a bit astray. The area that we're going to focus on in today's video are the helmets worn by these Scandinavian peoples. And perhaps a tricky part of the history is that we really don't know much about their helmets at all. Now, in one of my older videos where I show getting into this Viking era equipment, someone left a comment stating that Vikings didn't wear helmets, which I frankly disagreed with. We had a discussion, and they were essentially saying that Vikings didn't have helmets. There's no really archaeological evidence to support it in that time period. And at the end of the day, it got down to, I believe, a little bit of a translation loss, as I believe English wasn't their first language, in which case they did very good being able to discuss. Of course, I don't speak the language that they speak. But for me, that statement is very misleading and false. And basically what it got down to is I raised several points, and they said, well, yes, of course, they could have got helmets in other ways. However, they didn't have helmets. And I thought it was a bit confusing. So in this video, we're going to outline the styles of helmets that these Scandinavian raiders likely would have had, how they would have got hold of them, how common were they, as it is actually quite a complicated topic. The helmet that I'm wearing right now is called the Hjelmenbu helmet. Forgive my pronunciation, it's probably not that accurate, which was found around Oslo in Norway in the farm of Hjelmenbu. It's dated to around the 9th, 10th century. So this is a Scandinavian found helmet which hasn't been found in any other parts of Europe or the world, which is likely of Scandinavian origin. So there is already, I believe there's 2 or 3 Hjelmenbu style helmets found in roughly the same burial mound. So there is what seems to be a Scandinavian exclusive helmet. We of course have helmets in the Vendel period, which is the period before the Viking Age, worn in Scandinavia, and of course the contemporary tribes and societies that they were interacting with, such as the Saxons and the Rus, also had helmets. So it seems very weird for me to say that the Scandinavians didn't have helmets in the Viking Age when we know that they had them in the Vendel period beforehand. We do have, though given very few, archaeological finds of what seem to be Scandinavian exclusive helmets in the Viking Age, and it would have been decently simple enough for them to get hold of a helmet either by trade or by raiding, as a helmet is the most important piece of armour you can have throughout all of human warfare. So the question sort of comes down to this, I suppose. We have very few archaeological finds of helmets in the Scandinavian countries dated to the Viking Age. Therefore, the statement of Vikings didn't have helmets can be taken as they didn't produce helmets in Scandinavia, which I think is probably more what this particular individual was trying to say, is that the Norse at that time didn't produce helmets. Why are helmets such a rare find in Scandinavia? I think there's a few reasons for this. One, we do again have finds of helmets in Scandinavia, which to me indicates that yes, this individual that was buried in this burial mound was likely very wealthy. There's a lot of jewellery and swords and other wealthy parts, items found in this chamber. which would indicate that yes, this person was of decently high status. And of course, most Vikings in this period were raiding because they weren't very high status. They wanted more material goods. So the armor that I'm wearing currently right now, a mail shirt, a Yeomanry helmet, would have been likely a professional raider or a lord or a jarl or someone of very, very high status to afford this amount of armor. Many Scandinavian raiders in this time period would likely have had either no armor at all, a spear and a shield. However, of course, protecting your head is the most important part of your body to protect. So if they couldn't afford or didn't have or couldn't steal any form of helmet, they likely would have had at least some sort of padded hat, a boiled leather cap. But just the idea for me that the blanket statement of saying the Vikings didn't wear helmets is false, because we have evidence for helmets. And for me, the issue is there are just so many ways that these raiders, these traders, these merchants would have been able to get hold of a helmet. And it is one of the it is the most crucial armament that a soldier could wear, is a helmet. Many of these raiders would have died abroad, therefore we can't really distinguish a Scandinavian helmet, nasal helmet, to a Saxon nasal helmet in the Viking Age, so it's highly likely that most Viking Age warriors were just wearing the simple nasal helmet at the time. Very easy to get hold of, very commonly made, probably not that expensive as it's not super unique in its construction. And of course, lots of these helmets were made of iron, so the corrosion on even the Yeomanry helmets, lots of helmets are probably just lost to time, unfortunately, as they have rusted away. But again, these Vikings were raiding or traders, so there's just so many ways that these soldiers could have got hold of helmets. So it's very interesting how we seem to have very few finds of helmets in Scandinavia, or distinctly Scandinavian helmets. However, they do exist. And again, the Rus, the Saxons, and other Mediterranean cultures that the Vikings were coming in contact with had helmets, and the Vikings in the period before had helmets. The Vendel period beforehand had helmets. So I think to state that Vikings didn't have helmets is wrong, because there's so many ways that they could have got hold of them. We have archaeological finds. Now, yes, I think many probably didn't have them. Many of them weren't armored, right? These guys weren't professional soldiers. They weren't equipped by their town or anything like that. But it's the sort of first piece of armor that you'd want to get is a helmet. You'd steal one if you were on a raid, if you were raiding a Saxon fort. Oh, look at that armor. Funnily enough, I'm going to take that because it's pretty darn important. Or again, if you're a trader or a merchant, you're trading and buying these types of items that are very valuable. That could perhaps question, what was this helmet, the Yeomanry helmet? Likely it was a Scandinavian-made helmet. Again, we don't have any finds in any other part of the world. That was likely used by a very, very wealthy Viking Age raider or some form of high-status individual. So the overall question of did the Vikings wear helmets, I think is decently safe to answer that. Yes, many of them did. Many of them likely didn't as well. Remember, these guys are just raiders. Lots of them are farmers or other goers that just went on a raid. They went on a Viking. However, any decently professional raider or high-up person in society would have likely purchased armor if they were going on raids, because funnily enough, it could save your life. And even if you couldn't afford it, I think it's highly likely that on your raid you managed to get some form of armament. A helmet would have been probably the most sought after piece of armor. And again, we know that they had them in the period before. We know that there are some very few Scandinavian helmet finds. We know that they were abroad in areas that had helmets. How are we supposed to tell a Saxon nasal helm purchased or bought from or stolen from a Saxon on a Saxon battlefield? How are we supposed to determine that whether that was worn by a Scandinavian or a Saxon? There's so many ways they could have got hold of helmets. Throughout all of human history, helmets have been the most important piece of armor. For whatever reason, we don't have very many Scandinavian helmets found in Scandinavia. Again, likely because many of them would have probably decomposed or rusted away, unfortunately. Many of the Scandinavian countries have a lot of weather conditions which iron doesn't last in if it's not taken care of. So lots of these helmets through rain and snow and summers would have likely have decomposed and rotted away. And many of these raiders would have probably died abroad, or their armor would have been passed on and passed on and passed on and eventually lost. So I think to state that the Scandinavians from the years roughly 793 to 1066 forgot how to make helmets doesn't really make sense. Thank you very much for watching this video. If you'd like to support the channel, please consider becoming a channel member. Your support greatly helps, and a special thanks to our members as well for your additional support. Of course, just watching the videos, liking and subscribing is also a great help. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll hopefully see you in the next video.